Hello and welcome to another edition of the GNAT TV News Project In Depth. I'm Andrew McKeever and I'll be your moderator today, and it's my great pleasure to have with us today a very special guest, Professor Eric Davis. He's a professor emeritus from Middlebury College in political science. He's a widely known, nationally recognized expert on Vermont politics, and I can tell you that it's almost impossible to read an article about Vermont politics without seeing a comment or a quote from Professor Davis. So we're delighted to have you with us today, and welcome to all of you joining us. Professor Davis, obviously we are in a very interesting and unusual election year here in 2016. We have open seats for the governor's office, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and even though they won't be determined by the election in November, changes in leadership in both the State House of Representatives and the State Senate. How long has it been since we've had a year like that, where that many seats has been up for grabs?
Well, to have just about everything in the state open, it's been quite some time. In 2010, though, we had the same situation when we had both the governorship and the lieutenant governorship open. Yeah. And the same thing happened back in 2002. It's often the case that when the governor decides to leave office, the incumbent lieutenant governor tries to move up. So those two are often vacant at the same time. One of the interesting things about this election for me is this is the first time we've had an open seat governor's race in Vermont in a presidential year for over 30 years. The last time the governorship has been vacant in 2010, and then before that 2002, and going back before that 1990, those were all off-year elections. You have to go back to 1984 when Dick Snelling decided not to run for re-election after 4 terms to have an open governor's seat in a presidential year. And what happened that year is Ronald Reagan won the electoral vote in Vermont as well as nationally. Vermont was still a predominantly Republican state at that time. And Madeline Kunin, the Democrat, won a narrow victory in the gubernatorial race. So we saw a split outcome. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a somewhat similar outcome in Vermont this year, with Hillary Clinton winning the state's electoral votes rather comfortably, and Republican Phil Scott perhaps winning a narrow victory in the gubernatorial race.
Do you think Donald Trump is going to drag Phil Scott down a little bit in terms of what he might be getting?
No, I don't think Donald Trump is going to drag Phil Scott down, because Scott has distinguished himself from Trump for a long time. It was as early as December of last year when Scott said that he could not support Trump. He said before the Vermont primary in March he would not support Trump if he ended up as the Republican nominee. So I think Scott has inoculated himself against Trump. The other thing in Vermont, of course, we do not have straight ticket voting. In some states, you can put a straight ticket mark on a ballot or pull a lever or something like that. Here you vote office by office. So what Phil Scott hopes is that Vermont voters, after voting for 3 Democrats at the top of the ballot, for president, for senator, and for U.S. House, will then switch and vote for Republican for governor. And we'll see whether that happens.
And conversely, do you think Hillary Clinton is going to give Sue Minter a bit of a boost?
Perhaps. But what I'm more interested in the national level, actually, is the effect of Trump and Clinton, both of whom are relatively unpopular, on the level of turnout in Vermont. Historically, turnout in Vermont presidential election years has been close to 70%, one of the best states in the country in terms of turnout. This year you have a situation where there may be some ardent Bernie Sanders supporters who aren't particularly enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton, and you have some Republicans who aren't enthusiastic about Donald Trump. And will the state races be enough to draw those people to the polls? How will the third-party candidates, Gary Johnson, the Libertarian, and Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, do in Vermont? And what always happens, at least in previous elections, is the third-party candidates do better in polls in late September than they do on Election Day in early November. We'll see whether that trend plays out again. But I would say that the concern actually for Sue Minter and the Vermont Democrats is going to be more that people who supported Bernie Sanders intensely earlier in the year aren't enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton and don't feel as enthusiastic about voting this year. So the turnout could end up being 65% rather than 70%. And if the turnout declines for that reason, I think it's Sue Minter who ends up getting hurt.
Well, how do you assess the race so far? I mean, it seemed to me that Phil Scott started off with several advantages. He was an incumbent office holder. He had been on statewide ballots for three times. So he started off, I think, with a greater degree of name recognition than perhaps Sue Mendra did, whose main job up to that point, or for what she had been best known for, was her work during Tropical Storm Irene and the Transportation Department. Is Phil Scott, holding a slight edge, or is this kind of
He may be. I mean, first of all, in terms of name recognition, while Scott started out ahead, Minter's certainly going to catch up, because this is going to be the most expensive gubernatorial race we've ever seen. I would not be surprised if, when all is said and done, there's $4 million or more spent on this open seat governor's race. Each candidate will probably spend about $1 million, maybe a little bit more. And then party committees, the Democratic Governors Association, the Republican Governors Association, outside PACs and super PACs could each spend $1 million on each side. So both candidates will have plenty of name recognition by election day. Every time we've had an open seat race in Vermont, in the last 50 years or so, going all the way back to 1968, the governorship has switched parties. And there's a time for a change sentiment that motivates a fair number of voters in Vermont. And I think that is working to Phil Scott's advantage this year. Peter Shumlin will be leaving office as likely the least popular governor in modern times. I mean, his approval rating now is somewhere around 40%. And most governors, when they leave office, their approval rating is usually somewhere between 50 and 60%. So you have a combination of the time for a change sentiment, a relatively unpopular governor, and an economy. While Vermont's economy is certainly no basket case, the state's economy has been growing relatively slow compared to other states in the region, other New England states, and the country as a whole. So putting those things together, I think you get a recipe for a change in party control in the governor's office. Now, for that to happen, Phil Scott does need ticket splitting. In 2004 and 2008, Jim Douglas won the governor's race in both of those years, even though Democratic presidential candidates, Kerry in 2004 and Obama in 2008, did very well in Vermont. Now, Jim Douglas was the incumbent. Phil Scott is not. But my rough calculation is, if the voting turnout is somewhere between 65 and 70%, and Hillary Clinton ends up getting somewhere between the high 50s to the mid 60s as a vote share, which is about where I'd give her right now, roughly 1 out of 3 of the people who vote for Hillary Clinton for president need to split their ticket and vote for Phil Scott for governor in order for him to win. That's roughly the magnitude of ticket splitting we saw in the Jim Douglas races.
So what do you think will be the big issues that voters will be casting their ballots over? I mean, obviously the economy is always a mainstay. Bread and butter issues like that are clearly a primary driver. But we have a few other issues like healthcare, Vermont Health Connect, opiate and heroin problems that probably also be factoring in voters' thinking.
A poll done by the Castleton Polling Institute, that's a good polling organization in Vermont, for Vermont Public Radio and Vermont Digger earlier this year, showed that Vermont voters consider the economy and jobs to be the most important issue, with the opiate issue and the crime associated with it being the second most important. And on the economy and jobs, I think one reason that's ranked so high is that if you look at the numbers collected by the Vermont Tax Department or the U.S. Census Bureau over the last 5 or 6 years, middle-income families in Vermont have basically seen their income stagnant since the end of the recession in 2009, 2010. While their income on paper may have gone up a little bit, taxes and fees, the cost of health care, other things have gone up as well. So the bulk of middle-income Vermont households have not seen an improvement in their economic condition, and that doesn't help someone from the incumbent governor's party who's seeking another term. On the opiate issue, I think there's an increasing realization this is a problem. It's resulting in various types of crime, and then you have to figure out how you deal with that. There's also sort of the social issues associated with it, with people increasingly reliant on painkillers and all that sort of thing, and how does it relate to patterns of medical practice. So there's a need for attention. Some of that is things that the state can do. Some of it also has to be done by others, such as the medical community, social welfare organizations, and so forth.
What do you, it seems to me that wind energy, kind of out of nowhere, seems to have also entered into the race. It came into force in the primaries with Matt Dunn losing the endorsement of Bill McKibben over the local siting, local input on siting of these projects. Sue Minter, as I understand her position, seems to be in favor of wind projects. Phil Scott, not so much, if at all. Is that going to be anything that's going to motivate a lot of voters?
It hasn't ranked high on polling questions about what's the most important issue. What the polls seem to say on that issue is statewide, the public supports wind energy. In the local communities where wind projects are being proposed, there's often strong opposition.
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard, exactly. It's a good idea, but don't build the towers, don't build the turbines where they'll block my view.
You were mentioning before we went on the air that transportation might be a big factor. How's that going to play?
Well, again, this may not be an issue in the election, but I think it is something that has to be on the agenda for the governor and the legislature over the next few years. And it's an issue that a lot of states are facing. Vermont, like most states, relies on a motor fuels tax to pay for maintenance and building of new roads. And what's happening all over the country is as more fuel-efficient vehicles are replacing older vehicles, and in some instances, hybrid or electric vehicles are replacing gasoline-powered vehicles, the volume of motor fuels sold is declining. So that means that the revenues coming into state transportation funds are declining. And just about every state around the country is facing this issue. And just about every state is looking at three possible ways of rectifying that balance. One is staying with a motor fuels tax but raising the rate. Voters don't like that because it makes gasoline more expensive. The second is relying more on fees to fund the transportation program, charge more for driver's licenses, registering vehicles, and things like that. Voters don't like that because it will cost them more to
money.
register their car. The third, which a few states are looking at, is tolling. In urban states, that can work, but Vermont is not the sort of state where you can put you could put tolls on the interstate, but that's about it. And the fourth is a miles travel tax, which is very unpopular in those states that are farther along discussing it than Vermont is. And there's also the technical problem of in new cars, you can pretty much keep track of how many miles it's driven, but in older cars, that isn't possible. But the governor and the legislature are going to have to deal with this somewhere over the next 5 years, figure out a stable source of long-term funding for the state's
isn't this what
transportation
the
program.
controversial carbon tax proposal?
No, this is not a carbon tax. This is a so-called miles travel tax, which the state Republicans have also been attacking because some Democrats did talk about it in the last session.
Okay. I was just wondering, Phil Scott, I know, has made a major point out of saying that he doesn't want to increase state spending faster than state revenue growth checks in at. In other words, if it grows by 2%, then we can't have any more than 2% spending, increase in spending in state spending. I guess my thought on that is like, well, that sounds like a common sense, reasonable approach, but how realistic is it? I mean, with all the needs that the state has, can we really do that?
I'm not sure, and I think the real crunch comes in healthcare, because one of the single largest programs in the state budget is Medicaid. The federal government pays a little bit over half the cost of Medicaid, the state bears the rest. And Medicaid has been expanded in Vermont in the last few years, as it has in other states. So the Medicaid caseload has been growing. I think it's close to 100,000 people now, which is about one out of 7 Vermonters roughly. If you limit Medicaid spending to 2%, that's probably no more than half of the rate of spending increase in recent years. And the providers are going to complain. I mean, Medicaid already pays physicians and other providers less than Medicare or private insurance. And if the Medicaid reimbursement rate is lowered even further, that's not going to make the providers happy, and there'll be a big cost shift, particularly onto the employer-paid insurance programs. So, holding state spending to the growth of income is going to be a real challenge. In my view, that equation has to be looked at on the income side as well as the spending side. That the state needs to increase the amount of revenue, not necessarily through raising taxes, but through increasing the labor force. One of the interesting things about Vermont's population right now is it's the second oldest in the country. Only Maine has a higher average population. The Vermont labor force has been declining over the last half dozen years. Actually, there are fewer people in Vermont today working than was the case before the recession back in '07.
Wow,
that's not the case nationally. That's not the case in most states. The reason that trend is present in Vermont is not because there have been huge layoffs or anything like that. It's because the state is aging, and people retire from the workforce and aren't replaced by younger workers. And if the current trend continues, what you're going to have in Vermont is a workforce that makes up a lower and lower share of the population as the population gets older, and the state revenues will be struggling to keep up with the demand for spending. So in my view, I know this is a controversial proposal, I think one of the best things the state could do would be to set a goal of increasing the population, particularly people between ages 25 and 45.
So how do we do that?
Well, you need more jobs, first of all, and I think particularly you need to have that growth outside Chittenden County.
Yeah.
I mean, what we've seen in the last half dozen years or so is a bifurcation in economic growth in Vermont. Chittenden County is actually doing pretty well. In terms of population growth, the census shows in the last census period, they were up between 4% and 5%, while the rest of the state was basically stagnant. There's plenty of good jobs in Burlington and surrounding communities. The challenge is outside of Chittenden County. And you need incentives for businesses to come in and provide good jobs. You need to have a first-rate infrastructure in both transportation and communications, which Vermont does not have at present. You need, for in-state residents, you need to do something to stop the loss of young people to other states, go to college in other states, and then take jobs in other states. Vermont actually has one of the highest, if not the highest, percentage of college-age students attending college outside of the state, of any state in the country. UVM has one of the lowest percentages of in-state students of any state-supported institution. So in my view, again, this is one of the things that I think the next governor and legislature need to figure out is Vermont spends a lot of money on education, but it goes almost exclusively to K-12. In my view, we don't spend enough on pre-K education, and we don't spend enough on post-secondary education. And what I'd like to see is, I don't think we need to spend more on education, but reallocate what we're doing now so we spend a little bit less on K-12 and a little bit more on pre-K, because every study that I'm aware of says that good pre-K education is one of the best things in terms of getting kids ready to learn and ready to do well in school and later in life do good things after they graduate. And at the post-secondary education, the state needs to provide more support to the public higher education institutions in the state so that they have more attractive programs, can lower their fees, so that more 18-year-old Vermonters will decide to go to college in Vermont rather than go out of state.
Well, those are all going to be big challenges.
Yep.
I'm anticipating the howls of protest among folks who think that we're not spending enough yet on K through 12 education.
Well, there are some, and the population growth issue. When I've talked about this in talks I've given around the state, there are some people who are adamantly opposed to it, who think Vermont has too many people already.
Right. Let's turn to the lieutenant governor's race between Randy Brock and David Zuckerman, two really contrasting personalities, I think it's fair to say. Randy Brock, former state senator from Franklin County, former candidate for governor in 2012, former state auditor too, if I recall correctly, versus David Zuckerman, who's currently a state senator from Chittenden County and has the backing of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the progressives as well.
That's right. And David Zuckerman won a three-way Democratic primary for that office. He defeated Shep Smith, the Speaker of the House, who many people thought was the leading candidate.
That surprised me, I got to tell you.
And as well as Keisha Ram, an up-and-coming legislator from Burlington. The question for me about this race is, one of the things that helped Zuckerman win that primary was that he was endorsed by Bernie Sanders. And are Vermonters ready to vote for an unabashed progressive, whether it's capital P or small p progressive, candidate for a statewide office whose name is not Bernie Sanders? And what strikes me about the lieutenant governor's race is There's more of a gap between David Zuckerman, who's to the left of Sue Minter on quite a few issues, and Randy Brock, who's a little bit, but not much, to the right of Phil Scott. But the gap between David Zuckerman and Randy Brock is much larger than it is between
Canyon-like.
between Sue Minter and Phil Scott.
Right.
So again, I at this point would give Randy Brock a slight edge, but there's still 6 weeks to Election Day, and a lot can happen. And this race may be one where voters haven't yet checked in on it.
Right.
You have to remember that although there was a lot of attention to the primary in August, Sue Minter won her Democratic primary with about 35,000 votes, and Phil Scott won the Republican primary with about 25,000 votes. To be elected governor, whoever wins is going to need about 150,000 votes. So there are a lot of people who didn't vote in the primary, may not have paid all that much attention to the politics over the summer, who will be voting in November.
So the key then, it sounds like, is which side gets its supporters to the polls.
Yeah, and there, in that case, the Democrats in Vermont have a substantial advantage. The Democrats have more money for what's called field organization, which is offices around the state from which people can make calls, mobilize voters, make sure people are registered, encourage them to vote early. If they're core supporters, early voting has now begun, so you can cast your ballot now anytime up until Election Day, an absentee ballot. And historically in Vermont, the Democrats have had a considerable advantage in that kind of organization and the finances that are needed to support it, and I don't see that changing this year.
How critical do you think the debates that Sue Minter and Phil Scott, and joined occasionally by Bill Spaceman Lee, will be in determining them? I think there can be a total of 11 or 12 altogether.
Yeah, in my view, they're much less than the national debates, because the national debates, the presidential debates, there's only 3 of them plus one vice presidential debate, but they have huge viewing audiences. It's estimated that the viewing audience for the first Trump-Clinton debate is going to be somewhere between 80 and 100 million. So, that's close to half of all adults who may be watching that debate. The debates in Vermont are going to have much smaller viewership than that. Some of them don't get broadcast coverage at all, or simply reported in print media or online. So, to the extent these debates mean anything, I think it's more through news coverage of it than people who are listening or watching directly.
Right, all right. So in the time we have left, one other race is kind of intriguing, although I think the outcome is probably not in doubt, and that's, of course, the U.S. Senate race between incumbent Senator Pat Leahy and his challenger, Scott Milne, who, as we all remember, almost became governor 2 years ago, and it would have been a shocking upset, I think, of Peter Shumlin in 2014, but lost narrowly by 2%, I think, much to the surprise of, I think, most people. Certainly surprised me, anyway, that the margin was that close. And Milne has been trying to pick away at Leahy a little bit over the EB-5 question and a few other issues. He's been trying to kind of make a virtue out of the fact that his campaign has not been well funded, and he's running a fairly threadbare George Aiken-like from the 30s kind of campaign. Is there any chance that Scott Milne is going to come close to his numbers in 2014?
I would very much doubt it. A poll I saw last week indicated that Senator Leahy has an approval rating of about 66%. That's about 25 points higher than Peter Shumlin was at this point in the 2014 campaign. Also in 2014, there was no presidential race, there was no U.S. Senate race that year, so the governor was it. This year, we have the presidential race plus all the other open state seats. So Scott Milne's has trouble getting media attention for his campaign because the press is spread much more thinly. The question for me is not so much will Pat Leahy win, but can Scott Milne chip a little bit into Senator Leahy's support? 12 years ago, Leahy was reelected in 2004 with 71% of the vote. He got 65% 6 years ago. The question for me is, can Scott Milne hold Senator Leahy below 65% so that his vote share will have declined for 2 consecutive elections?
Which still kind of gives him a pretty good feeling going back to Washington.
That,
he's sort of
the folks and in my view, this is Senator Leahy's last campaign. He was 34 when he was elected back in 1974. He'd be well into his 80s if he were to run again 6 years from now. So my guess is this is his last re-election, and we will see quite the battle to replace him in 6 years.
That will be an interesting race 6 years from now.
Yes.
One last race we could touch on briefly here is the Attorney General's race, also open this year with the retirement of long-serving William Sorrell. I think he goes back to the Dean administration, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So he's retiring after several terms, and the Democrat nominee is T.J. Donovan, the state's attorney from Chittenden County, who challenged Sorrell 2 years ago, made it a pretty competitive primary. And he's facing a Republican challenger named Deborah Bucknam from Walden, Vermont. Also, interestingly enough, a bit of a local note, Rosemary Jakowski from Bennington, who's running as a Liberty Union candidate for that same office. So I guess the conventional wisdom is that T.J. Donovan's a shoo-in on this one.
I would say T.J. Donovan is likely to win. The Republicans did recruit a qualified candidate. Deb Bucknam has practiced law in Vermont for a long time, and she certainly has thought a lot about the issues before the Attorney General's office. But she has much less name recognition than T.J. Donovan, who's run statewide before, is the incumbent prosecutor in the state's largest county. The latest financial reports show that T.J. Donovan has about 7 times more resources in his campaign fund than Deb Bucknam does. So I'd expect T.J. Donovan to win. The interesting thing will be if Phil Scott and Randy Brock end up winning the governorship and lieutenant governor, T.J. Donovan will be the senior elected Democrat in the state. So
wow. And he's a fairly young guy.
He's a fairly young guy. He's in his 40s.
Yeah, so maybe more elections to come.
Yeah. Well, the other question about someone coming back too has to do with Shap Smith. I don't think. I mean, Shap's defeat in the primary was, I think, unexpected to many people, and my guess is we've not seen the last of him. That he'll run again for something, whether it's the state legislature, maybe try and come back through the Senate. The senator from his county is a Republican. It's also possible that if Phil Scott is elected governor, Shep Smith might decide to run again for governor in 2 years. Remember, he was in that race initially until his wife developed some health issues, and he pulled out and then came back in as a candidate for lieutenant governor.
Yeah, it's hard to picture Shep Smith just going back to being, I don't mean this the wrong way, just a lawyer in Burlington.
So I think
a lot of energy there.
I think we'll see him again.
Well, that, I guess, about sums it up, I think. Thank you very much, Professor Davis, for being with us today and sharing your insights and knowledge about the election campaign and Vermont politics in general. Really great to have you with us today. Appreciate you making the time.
My pleasure, and thanks for inviting me down here to Bennington County.
Well, we'll have to have you back again, maybe after the election, so we can analyze all the results. And thank all of you, too, for watching today. We hope you've enjoyed our newest edition of GNET TV's News Projects In Depth. I'm Andrew McKeever, the News Director of the GNET TV News Project. It's been my pleasure to be with you today, and we'll see you the next time. Have a good day.